Commander Elias Voss had not eaten in 3 days. He stood at the viewport of his small transport ship and watched the Thalvaran spire grow larger against the black curtain of space, a massive structure of glass and light that twisted upward like a frozen tornado, home to the galactic conquered and every alien species that mattered in the known universe. His stomach made a low sound, something between a growl and a groan, and he pressed his fist against it like he was trying to silence a disobedient soldier. The food stores had gone bad 2 days into the FTL jump when a radiation leak crept into the cargo bay and turned everything into toxic sludge. And by the time he realized what had happened, there was nothing left but water and discipline, and Elias had plenty of both. He docked the ship with steady hands and stepped out into the receiving bay where the air tasted like metal and flowers, and something electric he could not name. 2 guards waited for him, tall creatures covered in hard blue shells with eyes like polished stones, and they looked at him the way someone might look at a stray dog that wandered into a hospital. "Commander Voss of Earth," one of them said in a flat, translated voice, "you will follow us to the welcoming committee." Elias nodded and walked behind them through corridors that hummed with soft light, passing dozens of alien species he had only seen in briefing files, creatures that floated and creatures that crawled and creatures made of what looked like living smoke. None of them ate food. That was the thing nobody back on Earth had fully understood until the deep space probe started making contact, that in a galaxy full of intelligent life, almost none of it needed to eat the way humans did, because most species fed on light or radiation or chemical reactions deep inside their own bodies, and the idea of putting dead organic matter into a hole in your face and grinding it with bones was considered disgusting beyond words. Elias knew this, and he had trained for it, and he had told himself 100 times that it did not matter what they thought because he was here to represent 8 billion people, and he would do it with dignity. But 3 days without food made dignity a heavier thing to carry. The welcoming chamber was enormous, a circular room with a ceiling so high it vanished into soft blue mist, and arranged in a wide crescent were 12 alien ambassadors seated on platforms that matched their body types, some chairs and some pools and some just open air for the ones that hovered. At the center of the crescent sat Ambassador Kelvith of the Murathan Empire, an insected creature nearly 8 feet tall with a segmented body the color of dark amber, and 4 arms folded neatly across his thorax, and his head was a smooth, angular thing with compound eyes that reflected the light like shattered mirrors. Elias had read the file on Kelvith, a senior diplomat, a political predator in his own right, known for blocking new species from joining the conquered if he decided they were beneath him. Beside Elias stood his assigned liaison, a small furred creature barely 4 feet tall named Sira, a Velasi with wide dark eyes and ears that rotated like satellite dishes, and she had been trembling slightly ever since she first stood near him. "Your biochemistry," she had whispered to him earlier in a voice like rustling leaves. "It is very loud to us, Commander, your stress hormones and your hunger signals. To a prey species like mine, it feels like standing next to a fire." "I am sorry," Elias had said. "Do not be sorry," she had replied. "Just please do not make any sudden movements." Now they stood before the 12 ambassadors, and the chamber was silent except for the soft hum of translation devices. Kelvith spoke first. "So this is the human," he said, and his voice buzzed through the translator like a wasp trapped in glass, "the representative of the species from the death world called Earth." "Commander Elias Voss," Elias said, keeping his voice even, "representing the United Earth Coalition, here to formally petition for trade rights and membership in the Galactic Conquered." "Yes, yes," Kelvith said with a dismissive wave of one of his 4 hands. "We have received your petition, and we have reviewed your species profile, and I must say it made for quite disturbing reading." A few of the other ambassadors shifted in their seats. Your species, Kelvith continued, evolved on a high-gravity world with extreme weather and a biosphere so hostile that nearly everything on it is either trying to eat something or trying not to be eaten, and you yourselves fall into the first category. We are omnivores, Elias said calmly. We can eat both plant and animal matter, but we are also capable of choosing what we eat and how we obtain it. Choosing, Kelvith repeated, and something in the way he said it made it sound like a joke. How fascinating that you frame a biological compulsion as a choice. Elias felt his jaw tighten, but kept his expression neutral. The conquered has welcomed many species, Kelvith went on, addressing the room now more than Elias. But I believe this is the first time we have been asked to welcome one that survives by consuming the dead flesh of other organisms, a practice that in the natural world is associated exclusively with non-sapient fauna. The words landed like stones in a pond, and Elias could see the ripples moving through the room, some ambassadors looking uncomfortable, and others looking at him with open revulsion. His stomach chose that exact moment to growl again. It was loud, a deep rumbling sound that rolled through the chamber like distant thunder, and the effect was immediate, because 3 of the smaller ambassadors flinched visibly, and one of them, a delicate crystalline being, actually floated backward several inches. Kelvith's compound eyes glittered. It seems, he said slowly, that the human is hungry. Elias could feel the heat rising in his face, but he held steady. I apologize, he said. My food supplies were damaged during transit. I have not eaten in some time, and I would respectfully request that provisions be made available. Provisions, Kelvith said, tasting the word. You want us to provide you with dead matter to stuff into your ingestion cavity. Food, Elias said, yes. The room was quiet for a long moment, and then Kelvith leaned forward on his platform, and his mandibles clicked together in what Elias knew from the briefing files was a mirthful smile, which was not a sign of friendliness but a threat display. Of course, Kelvith said, we are not unkind, Commander. We would never let a guest go hungry, and in fact I believe a welcoming feast is in order. He looked around the chamber at the other ambassadors. Would the committee agree that we should provide our human guest with a proper welcome, one that honors his unique cultural practices? There were murmurs of agreement around the crescent, some genuine and some nervous, and Elias felt something cold move through his gut that had nothing to do with hunger. Syrah pressed closer to his side, and he felt her small hand grip the edge of his sleeve. Commander, she whispered so quietly that only he could hear, I do not know what they are planning, but something is wrong. The pheromones in this room have changed. Kelvith is excited, and that is never a good sign. Elias looked down at her and gave her the smallest nod. Thank you, Ambassador, he said to Kelvith. I look forward to your hospitality. Kelvith clicked his mandibles again. Oh, you will find it most memorable, Commander. I promise you that. They led him out of the chamber and down a long corridor toward what they called the Grand Ingestion Hall, and with every step, Elias felt more certain that whatever was waiting for him on the other side of those doors was not a meal. It was a test, and he was very, very hungry. The Grand Ingestion Hall was not a dining room. Elias understood that the moment the doors opened, and he saw the way the space was arranged, because there were no tables and no place settings and no food of any kind, just a vast crystalline chamber with hundreds of seats rising in circles around a central platform like an arena, and every single seat was filled with an alien being watching him with eyes and sensors and organs he did not have names for. They had come to watch him eat. The thought moved through his mind with a cold clarity that cut through the fog of hunger and exhaustion, and he straightened his back and walked forward because that was what Marines did when they walked into a trap. They walked in standing tall. Syrah stayed close behind him, her ears flat against her skull, and her fur bristling with fear that Elias could almost feel radiating off her small body. Kelvith was already on the central platform, standing tall and gleaming under the lights, with all four arms spread wide, in a gesture of welcome that fooled nobody. "Distinguished members of the Galactic Concord," Kelvith announced, his voice carrying through the hall with the help of amplifiers that made his buzzing tone echo off the crystal walls. "We gather today for a rare and educational event, a cultural exchange with our newest petitioner, the human species." Elias stepped onto the platform and stood where he was directed, at the center of every gaze in the room, and he could feel the weight of all those alien eyes pressing against him like a physical force. "As you all know," Kelvith continued, "the humans are unique among petitioning species in that they require the consumption of organic matter to survive, a practice we associate with lower fauna, and today we have the extraordinary opportunity to observe this process firsthand." He turned to Elias with those glittering compound eyes. "We have prepared something special for you, Commander." He gestured with one long arm, and from a side entrance, two attendants carried forward a cage made of thin silver bars, and inside the cage was a creature. It was small, about the size of a large rabbit, covered in soft gray-blue fur with 6 short legs and a round body, and a face dominated by 2 enormous luminous eyes that caught the light and reflected it back like twin moons. It was a Brelic. Elias had never seen one before, but he knew what it was from the database. A Tier 5 species classified as non-sapient by the Concord, used for various purposes across the galaxy, none of which were pleasant to think about. The Brelic in the cage was shaking so hard that its entire body vibrated against the bars, and it made a sound, a high, thin chirping that rose and fell like a baby crying, and every person in that hall could hear it. Kelvith looked at Elias and clicked his mandibles. "Since you are hungry, Commander, and since your species feeds on living organic matter, we have procured a suitable offering," he said, and there was no pretense now, no diplomatic polish, just raw satisfaction dripping from every translated word. "Please feed." The hall was silent. Every being in that room was watching Elias with a mixture of horror and fascination and something else, something eager, like spectators at a crash waiting for the impact. Elias understood the trap completely. If he ate the creature, he was a monster and proof that humans were beasts unworthy of the Concord, and every recording of this moment would be broadcast across the galaxy as evidence of human barbarism. If he refused, he was weak and starving and unable to perform basic biological function without the charity of superior species, a pitiful thing begging for scraps. Either way, humanity lost. He looked at the Brelic in its cage, and it looked back at him with those huge wet eyes full of a terror so pure and simple that it reached across every barrier of species and biology and touched something deep inside his chest. His stomach screamed at him. His hands were shaking, and he clenched them into fists at his sides, and then slowly, deliberately released them. The hall waited. Elias stepped forward, and every alien in the room tensed, leaning forward in their seats, recording devices activated, ready to capture the moment the predator revealed itself. He knelt down beside the cave. The Brelic scrambled to the far side, pressing itself against the bars, its chirping rising to a frantic pitch. Elias did not reach for it. Instead, he placed both hands flat on the floor of the platform where the creature could see them, open and empty and still, and he stayed there, kneeling, not moving, barely breathing. 10 seconds passed. 20. The Brelic's chirping slowed. 30 seconds, and the small creature's enormous eyes blinked once, twice, and it tilted its round head to the side. Elias slowly, very slowly lifted one hand and unlatched the cage door, swinging it open. The Brelic could have run, and no one in that room would have stopped it. But it did not run. It stayed where it was and watched the human with an intensity that seemed too sharp for something classified as non-sapient. Elias extended his open hand into the cage, palm up, Fingers relaxed, and he waited. The Brelic crept forward one tiny step at a time, its 6 legs moving in careful sequence, and it stretched its neck out and sniffed his fingers with a small, flat nose that twitched rapidly. Then it climbed into his hand. Elias lifted the creature gently and brought it to his chest, and cradled it there against the steady rhythm of his heartbeat, and the Brelic pressed its face into the fabric of his uniform, and its shaking stopped. The hall was so quiet that Elias could hear the hum of the station's power core, somewhere deep below the floor. He stood up with the Brelic held against his chest, and turned to face Kelvith. The ambassador's compound eyes were wide, his mandibles frozen mid-click, and for the first time since Elias had arrived at the station, the insecto diplomat had nothing to say. Elias looked out at the hundreds of alien faces staring at him from the rising seats of the arena they had built to watch him be an animal, and his voice when he spoke was calm and steady, and carried to every corner of the crystal hall. "Where I come from," he said, "we do not eat what is afraid of us, we protect it." The silence that followed was so deep it felt like the room itself was holding its breath. Then Kelvith recovered, and the click of his mandibles was sharp and angry. "You have refused the hospitality of the Galactic Conquered," he said, and his voice had lost all its smoothness, and what was left underneath was cold and hard. "This is a formal insult to the welcoming committee, and under Conquered protocol it is grounds to deny your species membership permanently." The other ambassadors murmured and shifted, and Elias could see some of them nodding and others looking uncertain, and he knew that Kelvith was not bluffing. This was real. He had just given them the excuse they needed to shut the door on humanity forever. But he also knew something else. He knew what he had seen in that cage was not a cultural exchange or a diplomatic test, but cruelty dressed up in ceremony. And he knew that any civilization that handed a terrified creature to a starving man and called it hospitality had secrets it did not want examined. The Brelic chirped softly against his chest. Elias looked at Kelvith, and the ambassador must have seen something in the human's eyes, because his mandibles stopped clicking. "You wanted to see a monster," Elias said quietly. "I am going to show you one." He paused, and the Brelic nuzzled into his collar, and he held it a little tighter. "But it is not me." He turned and walked off the platform with the small creature pressed against his heart, and behind him the hall erupted into noise and chaos, and the sound of 500 aliens all trying to understand what had just happened. Sira was waiting at the door, and she fell into step beside him, and her eyes were wet. "Commander," she said in a voice that was barely a whisper, "no one has ever done that before. No petitioning species has ever refused the committee. They will try to destroy you for this." "Let them try," Elias said. "What are you going to do?" Elias looked down at her, and for the first time she did not flinch at his predator eyes. "I am going to need access to the Conquered archives," he said. "Every record, every law, every classification protocol going back to the beginning." "Why?" "Because I am going to find out what they are hiding," he said, "and then I am going to show the entire galaxy." Sira stared at him for a long moment, and then her ears slowly rose from their flattened position, and something changed in her expression, something that looked almost like hope. "I will help you," she said. They walked together down the corridor, and behind them the noise of the hall faded into silence, and the only sound was the soft, contented chirping of a small creature that had been offered to a predator and found shelter instead. Sira brought him nutrient paste that night, small tubes of gray-green gel that tasted like chalk mixed with seaweed, and Elias ate every single one without complaint, while the Brelic sat on the desk beside him and watched with its enormous moon-colored eyes. "It is not real food," Sira said apologetically. "It is what they feed to maintenance workers from the lower tiers, but it is the only organic nutrition I could find on the station without raising suspicion." "It is perfect," Elias said, And he meant it because after 3.5 days of nothing, even chalk-flavored paste felt like a gift from heaven. The Brelic chirped and nudged one of the empty tubes with its nose, and Elias squeezed a small amount onto his finger and held it out. And the creature licked it delicately, and then sneezed and shook its whole body in disapproval. "Even the Brelic knows it is terrible," Sira said, and the ghost of a smile crossed her furred face. Elias allowed himself a small laugh, and then turned to the data terminal that filled one wall of his assigned quarters, a curved screen of pale light that responded to touch and voice, and about 14 other input methods designed for species that did not have hands. "Show me everything," he said to Sira. "Start with the species classification system." She sat beside him, and her small clawed fingers moved across the interface with practiced speed, pulling up files and records and legislative documents that stretched back thousands of years, and what they found in those records changed everything. The Galactic Concord classified all known species into 5 tiers. Tier 1 was full sapient status with complete rights and political representation, and these were the species that ran the galaxy, the ones who sat in the big chairs and made the rules. Tier 2 was recognized sapience with limited self-governance, species that were considered smart enough to manage their own worlds but not sophisticated enough to have a real voice in conquered affairs. Tier 3 was provisional sapience, species still being evaluated, kept on probation for centuries at a time, while the Tier 1 powers decided whether they were civilized enough to matter. Tier 4 was disputed sapience, species that some scientists said were intelligent and others said were not, left in a legal gray area where they could be exploited by anyone willing to argue they were just clever animals. Tier 5 was non-sapient fauna, and that was where the horrors lived. "Look at this," Elias said, pointing to a subsection of the Tier 5 regulations that he had to read 3 times before he believed what it said. Tier 5 species had no rights under Concord law, none at all. They could be used for labor, for biological research, for raw materials, for breeding stock, and for what the documents called species-specific biological necessities. "What does that mean?" Elias asked. "Species-specific biological necessities." Sira was quiet for a long moment, and her ears were pressed flat, and her fur had gone dull in the way that Elias was learning, meant she was afraid. "It means," she said slowly, "that if a Tier 1 species has a biological need that requires the use of a Tier 5 organism, the Conquered considers it a natural right." Elias stared at her. "Show me the Marathons," he said. She pulled up the file on Kelvith's species, and Elias read it with a growing coldness spreading through his body that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. The Marathons were parasitoids. They reproduced by implanting their larvae inside living host organisms, hosts that needed to be warm-blooded and roughly a certain size, and capable of sustaining the growing larvae for weeks while they fed on the host from the inside out. The host survived the process, technically, most of the time, but what was left afterward was a hollow, broken thing that the Marathons discarded like an empty container. And the species they used most frequently as hosts were classified as Tier 5. They were legally breeding living creatures to be eaten alive from the inside, and the Conquered called it a natural right. "He called me a monster," Elias said softly. "He stood in that chamber and called my species barbaric for eating cooked meat, and his people do this." "It is not considered the same," Sira said, and her voice was thin and fragile, "because they do not use their mouths, because the consumption is internal and biological and involuntary. The Conquered classifies it as natural reproduction rather than predation." "That is insane." "That is the law." Elias kept digging. He found the crystalline hegemony, a Tier 1 species that expanded by colonizing ocean worlds and extracting minerals from the seabed using a process that boiled the water and everything in it. And on 17 of those worlds, There had been indigenous aquatic species with complex social structures and what appeared to be language, but the hegemony had classified them as Tier 5 before the colonization began, and so legally they were not people. They were just obstacles. He found records of the Velasi, Sira's own people, classified as Tier 3 for over 600 years, with their evaluation mysteriously never reaching a conclusion. And during those 6 centuries, they had been required to provide comfort liaisons to Tier 1 diplomatic staff, a practice that Sira explained with her eyes fixed firmly on the floor and her voice barely audible. "We are soft," she said, "and warm and small, and they find our presence soothing, and we cannot refuse because we are still being evaluated, and if we make trouble the evaluation goes badly." Elias felt something burning behind his eyes, and he did not know if it was rage or grief or both. He found 14 species currently classified as Tier 5 that showed clear indicators of sapience, language patterns and tool use and social bonding and mourning behaviors and problem solving. 14 species that by any reasonable standard were people, but had been labeled as animals because a Tier 1 power benefited from keeping them that way. The Brelics were one of them. He looked at the small creature sitting on his desk, the creature that had been offered to him as food, the creature that had chosen to climb into his hand, and he thought about the millions of Brelics across the galaxy living in cages and farms and breeding facilities, because someone with more power had decided they did not count. "The whole system," Elias said, and his voice was steady even though his hands were not, "it is not built on ethics, it is built on disgust." "What do you mean?" Sira asked. "I mean that the conquered does not define civilized as compassionate or just or fair. It defines civilized as does not remind us of predators. And as long as your cruelty does not look like eating, you can do whatever you want to whoever you want and call it natural." Sira was silent because she had known this her entire life, but had never heard anyone say it out loud. Elias began to compile everything into a single document, cross-referencing the conquered's own moral codes with the actual biological behaviors of its ruling species, building a case so thorough and so damning that no amount of political maneuvering could dismiss it. He worked through the night while Sira translated documents, and the Brelic slept curled in a ball on his lap. By morning, he had a file that contained enough evidence to shake the foundations of galactic civilization. "There is a protocol," Sira said when he told her what he wanted to do. "An old one, Article 7 of the Founding Charter. Any petitioning species can invoke it to bring a formal grievance before the full conquered assembly. It was meant as a safeguard against abuse of new species during the evaluation process, and it has not been used in over 1,000 years. Can they block it?" "No," Sira said, and something fierce and bright flickered in her dark eyes. "It is written into the foundation of conquered law. Even Kelvith cannot override the charter." Elias filed the invocation that morning. By midday, the entire station was buzzing with the news, and Kelvith had filed 17 separate objections, and every single one had been rejected, because the law was the law. The full assembly would convene the following day. Every species in the conquered would be watching. Sira stood beside Elias as he reviewed his notes one final time, and she looked up at him with an expression he had not seen on her face before. "Are you afraid?" she asked. Elias looked down at her, and then at the Brelic sitting on his shoulder like it had always belonged there, and then at the data pad in his hand that contained the truth about the galaxy's most powerful civilization. "I have been hungry before," he said, "and I have been afraid before, but I have never been the kind of creature that hurts something weaker than me and calls it civilized." He tucked the data pad into his jacket. "Let us go show them what that looks like." The Grand Assembly of the Galactic Conquered was the largest political gathering in known space. The chamber was built into the core of the Thalvaran Spire itself, a sphere of living crystal nearly a mile across with thousands of platforms, arranged in concentric rings, rising upward into a ceiling that glowed with soft white light. And on those platforms sat the representatives of over 200 species, beings of every shape and size and composition imaginable. And beyond the chamber, the session was being broadcast to every corner of the galaxy through relay stations that carried the signal across light years in seconds. Billions were watching. Elias walked in through the petitioner's entrance at the bottom of the sphere. A small doorway that opened onto a single platform at the very center of the chamber, where he stood alone under the gaze of the entire civilized galaxy. He carried no weapons and no army and no fleet of warships. He carried a data pad and a small alien creature sitting on his shoulder. Kelvith opened the proceedings from his elevated platform with the confidence of someone who had won 1,000 political battles and expected to win this one too. The Assembly recognizes the invocation of Article 7 by the human petitioner, Kelvith announced, his voice amplified to fill the enormous space. And before we hear his grievance, I wish to provide context for those who may not be familiar with the species in question. He activated a display and projections filled the air around Elias showing images and data from the human species profile, footage of Earth's predators hunting, diagrams of human teeth designed for tearing meat, bioscans showing Elias' own body chemistry with his elevated cortisol and adrenaline highlighted in angry red. This is a predator species, Kelvith said, evolved on a Class 7 death world, biologically dependent on consuming organic matter, and currently standing before this assembly after refusing the Conquered's hospitality in what can only be described as an act of diplomatic aggression. He played the recording from the ingestion hall, the moment Elias' stomach had growled, slowed down, and amplified so it sounded like the roar of something massive and hungry. Several delegates shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Allowing this species into the Conquered, Kelvith continued, would be the equivalent of inviting a virus into a living body, and I urge the Assembly to consider very carefully whether it wishes to open that door. He finished and settled back on his platform with the satisfaction of a predator who had just laid the perfect trap, and Elias noted the irony of that thought with a grim internal smile. The Assembly recognizes the human petitioner, the automated moderator announced. Commander Voss, you may present your grievance. Elias stood in the center of the sphere with the light pressing down on him from every direction, and the eyes of the galaxy on his face and the Brelic warm and still on his shoulder, and he took one breath. Then he began. Ambassador Kelvith is right about us, he said, and his voice was calm and clear, and it carried through the chamber without the need for amplification because the acoustics of the sphere were perfect, and every whisper from the center could be heard at the highest ring. The Assembly stirred because they had not expected him to begin by agreeing. He is right that we evolved on a world that tried to kill us every single day, Elias continued. He is right that we eat, that we are predators by evolution, that our bodies are built for hunting and fighting and surviving in conditions that would destroy most of the species in this room. He paused and looked around the vast chamber. He is right that we have a history of violence and war and cruelty, that we have done terrible things to each other and to the creatures we share our world with, and I will not stand here and pretend otherwise because you deserve the truth and I am going to give it to you. The chamber was quiet now, a different kind of quiet than the theatrical silence of the ingestion hall. This was the quiet of 1,000 beings listening. But Ambassador Kelvith left something out of his presentation, Elias said, and with the Assembly's permission I would like to fill in the gaps. He activated his data pad, and the projections in the air around him changed. The first image showed a Merithan breeding facility on a world called Velthaxis, rows upon rows of sealed pods each containing a living creature with Merithan larvae growing inside them, and the data beside the image showed the survival rates and the number of hosts consumed annually, a number so large it made several delegates gasp. This is a Marathon reproductive facility, Elias said. There are over 400 of these across conquered space. They process approximately 9 million living hosts per standard year. Hosts that are Tier 5 classified species selected specifically because they are warm-blooded and the right size to sustain Marathon larvae. He let the number hang in the air. 9 million living beings per year, used as incubators and discarded when they are no longer useful. And this practice is legal under conquered law because it is classified as natural reproduction rather than predation. The projection changed. This is the ocean world Cathara 9 before the crystalline hegemony arrived, he said, showing a beautiful blue planet teeming with life. And this is Cathara 9 after, he said, showing a dead gray sphere stripped to bare rock. The indigenous species of this world had language and social structures, and what our scientists would call culture, but they were classified as Tier 5 3 months before the mining operation began. Another projection. These are the Velocity Comfort liaison assignments for the last 600 years, he said, and he did not describe what the data showed because the numbers spoke for themselves, and beside him Sira, who was watching from the petitioner's gallery, pressed her hands over her face. And this, Elias said, pulling up the final set of data, is a list of 14 species currently classified as Tier 5 non-sapient fauna that demonstrate clear and measurable indicators of sapience, including language and tool use and social bonding and mourning behaviors. He looked up at the assembly. 14 species that your own scientists have flagged as potentially sapient in internal reports that were never made public because reclassifying them would be inconvenient for the Tier 1 powers that currently use them as resources. The chamber erupted. Delegates shouted from their platforms in a dozen different languages, and the translation system struggled to keep up, and Kelvith was on his feet with his forearms spread wide demanding that Elias be silenced, declaring that the data was fabricated, that the human was a predator using manipulation tactics to destabilize the conquered. Elias waited. He stood still and quiet in the center of the storm, and he waited until the moderator restored order, and the noise died down to a furious murmur. Then he spoke again, and his voice had not risen once through the entire proceeding. "You look at me and see a predator," he said. "And you are right, I am one, every human is one. We carry it in our bones and our teeth and our eyes, and we have carried it for 300,000 years. But here is what you do not understand about predators who have learned to think." He looked directly at Kelvith. "We know what we are, we have always known, and because we know what we are, we have spent 10,000 years building laws and codes and moral systems to fight our own nature. We invented compassion not because it was easy, but because we knew what we were capable of without it. We look in the mirror and we see the monster, and we choose every single day to be something better. Can you say the same?" The silence that followed was the deepest silence Elias had ever heard in his life. Then from the upper rings of the chamber, a voice spoke, thin and wavering but clear, a delegate from a Tier 4 species that had not spoken in assembly proceedings in over a century. "The human speaks truth," the delegate said. "My people have known this truth, we have been afraid to say it." Another voice joined, then another, species from the margins of the conquered, who had kept quiet for centuries because quiet kept them safe, now finding their voices one by one like stars appearing after a long night. Kelvith saw it happening, saw the foundation cracking beneath him, and he played his final card. "I invoke the vote of consumption," he declared, and the chamber went cold. "Under Section 12 of the Conquered Charter, I call upon this assembly to formally classify the human species as non-sapient fauna, to be stripped of all protections and all petition rights effective immediately." The moderator confirmed the invocation. The law was clear. Any Tier 1 ambassador could call such a vote during an active petition. If the vote passed, humanity would not just be denied membership. Humanity would be declared animals. Open season across the galaxy. Kelvith looked down at Elias with those shattered mirror eyes, and his mandibles clicked in triumph. "Let us see," he said, "how your pretty words hold up against a vote." Elias stood on the platform with the Brelic on his shoulder, and the galaxy watching, and the fate of his entire species hanging on what happened next. He was starving and exhausted and alone. And he did not look away. The vote began, and Elias watched it happen from the center of the sphere like a man standing in the eye of a hurricane, watching the walls spin around him. Each species cast its decision through the assembly's central system, a simple binary choice, sapient or fauna, person or animal, and the results appeared in real time on the great display that wrapped around the upper ring of the chamber like a glowing belt. The Marathons voted first, and their decision was fauna, casting it with a speed that told everyone they had planned this long before Elias ever set foot on the station. The crystalline hegemony followed with the same vote, then the Thorax Dominion and the Savathi Collective and the Olkari Network. One after another, the Tier 1 powers lined up behind Kelvith, and each vote landed like a hammer blow. Fauna, 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 fauna. Elias counted them and did the math in his head, and the numbers were not good because the Tier 1 species held enormous voting weight under the Concord's weighted system, where influence was proportional to your tier, and 5 Tier 1 votes against was a wall that would take a mountain of lower-tier support to overcome. The Tier 2 species voted next, and they split almost evenly, some siding with the established powers out of fear, and some abstaining entirely, which was its own kind of cowardice, and a few brave ones voting sapient with the desperate energy of people who knew they might pay for it later. The count was not enough. Kelvith's mandibles were clicking in a steady rhythm of satisfaction, and he looked down at Elias from his elevated platform, with the expression of someone watching an insect struggle under glass. Then the Tier 3 voting began, and everything changed because of a small furred creature with dark eyes and satellite dish ears who stood up on her delegation's platform and did something that had never been done before in the history of her species. Sira spoke. "The Velesi delegation requests a point of personal testimony before casting our vote," she said, and her voice shook, but it carried, amplified by the chamber's perfect acoustics so that every being in the sphere could hear her. The moderator granted it, because the rules allowed it, even though Kelvith objected immediately with a sharp buzz of protest. Sira stood on her platform, and she was so small that the camera drones had to descend to capture her properly, and the image of her tiny trembling form was broadcast across the galaxy to billions of watching eyes. "My people have been classified as Tier 3 for 612 years, she said. "And in that time, we have provided comfort liaisons to Tier 1 diplomatic staff, because we were told that our evaluation depended on our cooperation, and we cooperated because we were afraid." Her voice cracked, but she kept going. "I have spent my life being afraid. Afraid of being touched, and afraid of being reclassified, and afraid of speaking, and afraid of every predator species that came through this station, because my biology tells me to run from anything with forward-facing eyes." She looked down at Elias, standing alone on the central platform. But this human with his forward-facing eyes and his predator body and his hunger that we could all smell from across the room, this human was offered a helpless creature, and he chose to protect it. And in 4 days, he has shown me more dignity than the Conquered has shown my people in 6 centuries. She turned to face the full assembly. "The Velesi are done being afraid." She cast her vote. Sapient. The effect was like a crack appearing in a dam. The Corsi delegation voted next, a Tier 3 species of aquatic beings who had lost 2 colony worlds to hegemony mining operations, and their vote was sapient. Then the Palathi, a Tier 4 species of gentle giants who had been providing forced labor to the Marathons for 300 years, sapient. Then the Drexy and the Nalvori and the Tessic and a dozen others, species that had been silent for generations now standing up on their platforms and casting their votes with voices that grew louder and stronger with each one. Sapient, sapient, sapient. Kelvith was no longer clicking his mandibles. He was standing rigid on his platform with his 4 arms pressed tight against his body, and his compound eyes darting from one voting delegation to another as the numbers shifted. 2 Tier 2 species who had abstained changed their votes, the Oralan Republic and the Murthani Federation, old civilizations who had long resented Murthan dominance and now smelled blood in the water. The count climbed. It was close, agonizingly close, because the weighted system meant that every Tier 1 vote against was worth 10 Tier 4 votes for, but there were so many of them now, so many voices that had been silent for so long, all speaking at once. The final tally appeared on the great display. Sapient by a margin of 11 points. Humanity was recognized as a Tier 1 sapient species, with full rights and representation in the Galactic Concord. The chamber erupted into a sound that Elias could not describe, part roar and part song and part something that had no human equivalent, the sound of 100 oppressed species releasing centuries of held breath all at once. Elias stood in the center of it, and he felt the weight of 4 days of hunger and exhaustion and fear lift off his shoulders like a physical thing rising into the light above him, and for a moment he could not breathe. Then Kelvith's voice cut through the noise like a blade. "This is not over," the Murthan ambassador snarled, and all 4 of his arms were raised, and his body was trembling with a rage that stripped away every layer of diplomatic sophistication and revealed the thing underneath. "The Murthan Empire does not recognize this farce, and we will deal with the human problem outside of conquered law if necessary." He stepped to the edge of his platform and looked down at Elias, and his ovipositor extended from his lower thorax in a threat display that every species in the room understood, a gesture that said, "I will use you as a host. I will plant my young inside you and let them eat their way out." The chamber went silent again. Elias looked up at Kelvith. And for the first time in the entire story, he stopped being a diplomat. He did not shout, and he did not threaten, and he did not move. He simply let go of the thing he had been holding behind his eyes for 4 days, the thing that discipline and training and compassion had kept locked away, and what came through was not anger. It was something older than anger. It was the thing that had kept his species alive on a world full of predators for 300,000 years. The thing that had driven them to tame fire and split the atom and cross the void between stars. The quiet absolute certainty of a creature that sat at the top of its food chain, not by accident but by right. Kelvith saw it, and his ovipositor retracted. Every alien in the chamber felt it, even the ones who did not have eyes, even the ones who perceived the world through sound or heat or electromagnetic fields. They all felt the moment when the human stopped pretending to be harmless, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop by 10 degrees. Elias spoke, and his voice was quiet, so quiet that the entire assembly held its breath to hear him. "You spent this whole week trying to prove that I am a monster," he said. "You offered me a living creature to see if I would tear it apart. You mocked my hunger. You tried to strip my people of their personhood. And through all of it I was polite." He paused. "I want you to understand something, Ambassador." Another pause, and in that silence the Brelic on his shoulder chirped once, a small bright sound that cut through the tension like a bell. "I was polite because I chose to be," Elias said, "not because I had to be." Kelvith took a step back on his platform. "You are not the apex predator in this room," Elias said. "You never were." It was not a threat, and everyone knew it was not a threat because threats were about the future, and what Elias had just said was about the present. A simple statement of fact delivered with the calm certainty of gravity. Kelvith sat down. The entire Murthan delegation sat down. Nobody said another word. In the weeks that followed, the Galactic Concord underwent the most significant political transformation in its history, a process that would later be called the Great Reclassification, beginning with the Sapiens Reform Act co-sponsored by the human delegation and 27 other species. The 14 Tier 5 species with documented sapience indicators were reclassified immediately. Granted protections and representation, the Brelics among the first, their luminous eyes and gentle chirps now recognized as the expressions of people rather than the sounds of property. The Murthan breeding farms were exposed in full, every facility on every world documented and broadcast, and the outcry was so enormous that even species who had voted against humanity joined the call for reform. Kelvith was recalled to the Murthan homeworld in disgrace, replaced by a younger diplomat who voted in favor of the Reform Act without hesitation. Sira became the first Velasi to hold a senior diplomatic post in Concord history, appointed co-chair of the Reform Committee alongside Elias, and on the day of her appointment, she stood on the assembly floor and did not tremble. The Velasi evaluation was completed in 1 week. 600 years of bureaucratic imprisonment ended with a single ruling, Tier 1 sapient species with full rights. And when the announcement was made, Sira's ears stood straight up, and she made a sound that her people had not made in public for generations, a high keening note that meant joy. On the evening after the Reform Act passed its final vote, Elias sat at a table in a small room on the station with a plate of real food in front of him. Cooked vegetables and grain and protein, prepared by a Tier 2 chef who had volunteered to learn human cuisine as a gesture of welcome. Sira sat across from him, and beside her were delegates from 12 different species, who had never shared a meal together before because some of them did not eat, and some of them had never been invited. The Brelic sat in Elias' lap and stole pieces of food from his plate with its small, dexterous paws, and he let it. "You know, Commander," Sira said, watching him eat with an expression that mixed fascination and warmth in equal measure, "for a monster you have remarkably good table manners." Elias looked at her across the table and he smiled, the first real smile he had allowed himself since arriving at the station, and the expression transformed his face from something hard and guarded into something warm and unmistakably human. "We have had practice," he said. The Brelic chirped and stole another piece of food, and the table laughed, 12 species laughing together for the first time, a sound that carried through the open door and down the corridor, and out into a galaxy that was just beginning to learn what it looked like when a monster chose to be kind.